just some housekeeping things. If you all, when we start to bring the slides up, if you all would mute yourself so we don't get any of the ambient news or any strange things going on in your life, in your house, being broadcast. Also, please use the chat to make comments or ask questions. If you just run your cursor to the bottom of the screen, a number of options will pop up. If you don't see chat, just roll your cursor over to where it says 3 dots and under it more. If you click that, chat will pop up. Type them in at any time. We will address those questions and comments to the speaker after the presentation is completed. And speaking of the speaker, a very clever use of words there, not bright, but maybe not so clever. Tonight's presenter is Terry Bohn. Terry is originally from Breckenridge, Minnesota, and in line with the Minneapolis and St. Paul Twin Cities. Breckenridge is part of the Twin Cities of Breckenridge and Wahpeton, North Dakota, probably the second largest Twin Cities in the upper Midwest. Currently, Terry is a member of the administration of the CHI St. Alexius Medical Center in Bismarck, North Dakota. And it's always good to have people in healthcare administration. My 42 years was very nice. He's an active contributor to various SABR research efforts, having contributed over 50 essays to the Bio Project and published 2 baseball research journal articles. In addition, he's published 3 books on North Dakota baseball. And I love the titles: Sunday Afternoon on the Prairie, The Growth of Baseball in North Dakota; Lots More Fun That Way, Amateur Baseball in North Dakota; and Hired Batteries, The Time of Independent Semi-Pro Baseball in North Dakota. Terry, of course, lives in North Dakota, in Mandan, just outside of Bismarck, and tonight presents the topic of Bushels of Fun, Early Baseball in the Black Hills. So Terry, let's bring up your slides and we'll get going. There you go.
Seem to have it here, Bob.
Everything looks right.
Okay. Thank you, Bob and Peter, and evening, everybody. Much of what we know of 19th century baseball is of the amateur pioneers in New York and the early professionals in the National Association and the National League. But we also know that as baseball grew in popularity after the Civil War and people migrated westward, baseball was soon played in every new settlement where people congregated. So tonight, I'd like to share with you a little bit about how baseball was introduced, took root, and really prospered for a short time in a pretty out-of-the-way place in the country, the Black Hills of South Dakota. For those of you who have not been to the area or are unfamiliar, the hills are tucked into the southwest corner of South Dakota, bordering Montana on the west and Nebraska to the south. Today, the area is best known for tourist attractions like the Sturgis Motorcycle Rally and Mount Rushmore. Much of what people know about early 19th century Black Hills is from the HBO series Deadwood. I've got a map. This is a modern day map, but in the north, you'll see Deadwood and Lead. And by the way, it's pronounced Lead, not Lead. They're small towns separated by just 3 or 4 miles. Then it was by railroad, today a 2-lane highway. But they became, that's where baseball was centered. that we'll talk more about later. Today, Deadwood and Lead are rather small tourist towns of just a few thousand people. Sturgis, near there, grew up around Fort Meade, which was an army post built to protect the early miners from Indian attacks. Rapid City today is the largest city in the region, about 70,000 people, and is the regional hub. As Bob mentioned, I've been interested in baseball in the Dakotas for some time, and have worked with Larry McCray and others with the Proto Ball project to document the origins of baseball in my state, North Dakota. But I knew very little about baseball in South Dakota until I learned of a book called Baseball in the Mining Camps. This is published by Mariah Press in Sioux Falls. So my presentation tonight is some of what is contained in the book and additional research that I have done. The Black Hills were included in the land ceded to the Great Sioux Nation as a part of the 1868 Treaty of Laramie, and therefore were technically not open to white settlement. Nonetheless, in 1874, the 7th Cavalry, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel George Custer, was dispatched to the Black Hills to investigate rumors of the discovery of gold. Some of you may remember John Popovich's presentation from last fall, Boots, Saddles, and Baseballs, Major Benteen and the Little Bighorn. Well, he discussed the first known baseball games in the Black Hills that occurred in 1874. 3 games took place, but I've only been able to find a box score for the first game, an 11-6 win by the Actives over the Benteens. 2 years later, in 1876, the 7th Cavalry was again ordered to the Little Bighorn in Montana. Now, I don't know a lot about the battle, but Benteen and his men of Company H fought about 2 miles from where Custer was, so they sustained fewer casualties. 2 members of the Benteens received gunshot wounds that day, but most of the Actives ball team of Company L died with Custer. A few of the early prospectors found deposits of any value, but that changed in 1876 when brothers Moses and Fred Manuel struck a huge deposit of silver and gold outside of Deadwood, the so-called Mother Lode, and the Homestake mine was opened. The town of Deadwood was formed soon after, when several separate mining camps incorporated and became a city. When news of the strike got out, thousands of people from all parts of the country flocked to the hills, hoping to strike it rich. Some of them were baseball players, or at least had knowledge of the game that they brought with them from their former home. One of the newcomers was a nephew of Dickie Pierce. You know that name. He was one of the early pioneers and one of the early shortstops in the National League. Soon ball teams were organized, and Pierce was a member of the first 9 organized in Deadwood in 1877. Now, the report on the previous slide said a game might take place provided suitable grounds can be secured. Well, as the name implies, the Black Hills are on mountainous terrain, so it was always a challenge for teams to find a plot of ground that was somewhat level and large enough to accommodate baseball grounds. The photo on the upper left shows an early game taking place literally on the side of a mountain. Some of these excerpts from the local papers detailed some of the challenges faced, such as the ground sloping or being inclined. Almost every ball diamond that was laid out sloped in some way. The upper right, for some reason, a freight train occupied the ball grounds one day. New grounds laid out in Deadwood were thought to be an improvement, but the left field was short because a brewery building was in the way. It wasn't until the 20th century when the region had the earth moving equipment been needed to construct adequate ball grounds. Hopefully you can read the caption on the top of the postcard, but Lead City literally needed to move a mountain to construct a new $15,000 ballpark. From last year's virtual, Fred, there was a presentation on team nicknames that I found very interesting. So I thought I'd share some of those that we found in the Black Hills. There were the Crook City Bushwhackers and the Rough and Readies of Central City, Favorite Ball Club of Fort Meade, Buffalo Gap Wind Cutters, and the Cornfield Pirates, the Central City Golden Belts. Now, many teams at the times called themselves the Invincibles, but here we had the Unvincibles in Deadwood, who were the most expert muffers in the city and the country. Mannheim and Spitz were partners in a dry goods store that sold supplies to the miners, and they sponsored the lead ball team. You can see them pictured in the uniforms in the white in the photograph there. These new uniforms ordered all the way from Spalding Company in Chicago. You know, the 80 stamps of Rapid City. Stamp was a machine used in the mines for crushing rock. Now there were, depending on the size of the mine, there were 10 stamp machines, 20, 40, 80 being the largest. So a large mine near Rapid City used the 80 stamp machine, therefore the name. And finally, there were the Keystone Holy Terrors. A prospector named William Franklin discovered a rich vein of quartz. He quickly staked out a claim in the town of Keystone and soon grew up around the new mine. At the time, it was customary for mines to be named after the wife of the prospector, and that's what Franklin did. His wife's real name was Jenny, but the story goes that Franklin was a regular at the many saloons in the area. Jenny had to go in at night and drag him home by the arm. As he was being escorted out one night, Franklin winked at his other drinking buddies and said, "Ain't she a holy terror?" So Franklin named his mine the Holy Terror, and the town's ball team took the same name. Although he never played baseball, one early resident of the Black Hills was influential in baseball at a national level. Joe Flanner was a young lawyer who came to Deadwood in 1877. He was elected district attorney, and he successfully prosecuted the first murder case in the country, in the territory. He only stayed a few years. About the mid-'80s, he moved to St. Louis, where he was a baseball writer for several different newspapers, and he was later hired by Charles Spink at the Sporting News, eventually becoming editor. Flanner used his legal background to help draft the national agreement in 1903. He also served as secretary to AL President Van Johnson and was an official scorer in the World Series. Now, this had really nothing to do with baseball at the time, but there was a brief birth announcement in the Deadwood paper in 1888 saying a boy of average weight was born to the Scott family. This little guy grew up to be this guy grew up to be Death Valley Jim Scott, a really good pitcher with the Chicago Cubs during the dead ball era. And it's likely that young Jim was influenced by the vibrant baseball environment that he grew up in the Black Hills. Brothers Leach and Harry Maskey were both major league outfielders with Louisville and Cincinnati in the American Association. Now, they didn't play baseball in the Black Hills, but they visited often because their two brothers, Charles and Frank, were both active in the baseball scene in Deadwood. Now, Charles was a newspaper man. He arrived in 1844, and you can see he had ownership in the Black Hills Pioneer. He helped organize the Deadwood Baseball Association in 1885, and he was a member of that 80 stamps. Now, Frank arrived in 1886, a fourth brother, was a member of the Deadwood Metropolitans in 1887. He was a pitcher, and you can see a little excerpt to the right there that, again, facetiously describes his pitching motion there. Obviously an exaggeration, but what I found interesting was that the writer knew of Adonis Terry, or maybe even had seen him pitch at one time. During the 19th century, several all-black teams were formed in the East, and there are numerous accounts of games against white teams. It also wasn't uncommon for black players to play on otherwise all-white teams, and the same was true in the Black Hills. In 1881, the Deadwood Stars played a game against the Plutonians. The Plutonians were from nearby Fort Meade. They were members of the all-black 25th Infantry, the so-called Buffalo Soldiers. Henry Marshall arrived in Lead in the late 1870s, and with his brother Romeo, operated a barber shop. He was known as one of the fastest runners in the area and won numerous foot races for money. When he was younger, he played center field on area teams, and one report noted that he, quote, runs the bases like Comiskey. He was a well-respected member of the community, and as he got older, he umpired most of the big games because he had a reputation for fairness and knowledge of the rules. So while integrated teams and games were not unusual, a black man umpiring a game between white teams would have been quite rare. Maybe Marshall's most important contribution to baseball was that he ran the betting pools for the big games out of his barber shop. The 1892 Nebraska State League was the only integrated league in organized baseball. 4 of the 8 teams employed black players. New Hall of Famer Bud Fowler played in Kearney, Nebraska that year. The league disbanded mid-season, and the Plattsburgh, Nebraska team made a tour into the hills for some games. And one of their members, John Patterson, was signed and played briefly with the Deadwood Nets. Now, Patterson, embarked on a long career with professional Negro teams in Philadelphia, Chicago, and Brooklyn, and even played with the Page Fence Giants. Even into the 1880s, Deadwood was still somewhat of a lawless and violent place. It wouldn't have been uncommon to see men still wearing six-shooters walking around town. And with high stakes and enthusiasm over baseball, it wasn't surprising that gunplay spilled over to the baseball diamond. On the top was the challenge game. This was one of the conditions set forth for a challenge game in Deadwood in 1889. I'm having trouble reading, so I'll let you read that. Hopefully you can see it okay. Now, apparently, the ban on firearms at the ball grounds was not strictly adhered to, as the next season, this incident occurred. I won't read all of this, but I'll paraphrase here. A base runner named Bittinger had an altercation with a second baseman named Apfield. A fight ensued, and at that point, a fan came out of the stands, pulled his revolver, and told Bittinger, who the paper called a dirty loafer and a white-livered cur, he would shoot him full of holes. Fortunately, the marshal interfered, and order was restored before any shots were fired. During the first decade of baseball in the hills, teams just played independently, scheduling games with opponents whenever they could secure dates and they could agree on the umpire and the amount of the wager. One-loss records were sporadic. Many teams simply just discounted games that they lost, in which they felt that the umpire was biased, the other team cheated. So no one really knew who had the best team. In 1885, an attempt was made to bring some order to the baseball scene when in August, an organization called the Black Hills League Baseball Association was formed. Originally, they proposed a home and home series for each team against other members, with the winner of the most games being declared the Black Hills champion. But because of the lateness of the season, they soon realized that they couldn't complete the schedule, so they just decided to crown a champion by staging a tournament at a fair in Deadwood in September. The event didn't go off very smoothly. Several teams failed to show up when they were scheduled to play, and some that did decided they'd rather attend the fair than play baseball. Finally, the Deadwood Mets defeated the Athletics of Fort Meade 29-21 in the championship game. The Deadwood paper tried to put a positive spin on the high-scoring affair, commenting, "The figures do not indicate a very scientific game, but there was nevertheless bushels of fun." Over the next several years, rather than forming another league, teams participated in year-end tournaments to determine a champion. But by the late 1880s and early 90s, Lead and Deadwood in particular both began to employ many players with professional experience by paying competitive salaries and offering what they called situations. Situations meaning basically make work jobs or phantom jobs offered by a local business. As a result, a heated rivalry developed between the two towns. One factor that contributed to this was that players in the Hills were certainly aware of what was going on in the East with the Brotherhood, with the Players League. I think that may have given them a sense they might have more choice in where they played and for whom. Also, I think at this time, many players didn't place a great distinction between the organized professional leagues and the outlaw leagues, such as in the Black Hills. They were just going to go where the salary was the highest. Excuse me. Another attempt was made to form a league in 1891. And Hot Springs, a little town in the south of the corner of the hills, joined Deadwood and Lead in the recruitment of outside pros by signing ex-major leaguer Bobby Black and future major leaguer Lou Kemp. Around this time, Al Lowry, who ran a cigar store in Deadwood and managed the town's ball team, was engaged as a correspondent to Sporting Life. His submissions began appearing in the publication late in 1891, and baseball in the Hills began to get some national recognition. In the fall of 1891, his first submission summarized the recently completed season in the Hills, and in January, he reported on a meeting to organize a league for 1892. Now, the only paper in the Hills that printed any kind of one-loss standings in 1891 was the Hot Springs Star. You can see them in the upper right there. Lead City, you can see, had a commanding lead, but Hot Springs claimed that they were the champion based on, one, that Lead had fattened up against last place Deadwood, that Hot Springs had won the head-to-head matchup in the season series with Lead, and that whenever they tried to schedule them, Lead kept ducking them. So Hot Springs claimed the 1891 championship. In Lowry's submission the following April in the lower right, he facetiously wrote that Hot Springs had erected a flagpole to fly the pennant that was so tall it could be seen as far away as Lead and Deadwood. Before we get into the 1892 season, I think you all appreciate the colorful and flowery language sometimes used by 19th century baseball writers. So I thought I'd share a couple of my favorites here. The Mets' attempt to catch up resembled a one-legged man trying to climb a ladder. The Mets batted him so hard from the start that the sound resembled a skeleton having a fit upon a hardwood floor. Walters, the new second for lead, played like a one-armed man washing dishes. Mr. Hurley sent one of his drop curves right over the plate. With his curves, Mr. Moore's back collided, making a sharp smack, like a young fellow meeting his best girl after an absence of a few weeks. And it would make a Granger week to see the high-priced ball tossers hit the ball with a sound like a small boy swelling a bass drum with a sock full of sand, and then run the bases and come across the plate like a string of wienerwursts. These writers really went overboard sometimes, but it's entertaining. Things are kind of wrapped up in 1892. Whoop, I went the wrong way. 1892, when Lead hired Ernie Beam, who would later pitch for Philadelphia in the National League. And so teams rarely published salary information, but according to Chris Rainey's SABR bio of Beam, Lead signed him, quote, at a salary that has never been paid a man outside of major leagues. Deadwood kept pace by adding former National League catcher Bill Traffley and also Kid Moeller. He's a rarity in that he was a left-handed throwing second baseman. Baseball Reference recognizes the 1892 Black Hills League on the minor league page, but it wasn't clear if an actual schedule was drawn up or not. But the imbalance of the number of games played suggests one was not. Teams often just fail to show up for games that were scheduled. Now, Sporting Life printed standings in the July 23rd issue showing Deadwood with a commanding lead, a 9-2 record. The image from the Deadwood Pioneer Times is hard to see. Standings similar, but not the same. Deadwood again in the lead, and for some reason they included Chadwin, Nebraska in the league in that publication. Regardless, in late July, the Deadwood Metropolitans and the Lead City Grays decided to play a 7-game series to decide the championship once and for all. Championship series was for a $1,000 purse. $500 was put up aside. Articles of agreement were signed, and the umpire was to be mutually agreed upon. Games were to be played under the rules of the National League, and 10-man rosters were set to prevent the addition of ringers and revolvers. Here are the lineups for the Deadwood Metropolitans and the Lead City Grays. Players with 2 asterisks indicate the major leaguers. As you can see, Traffley and Moeller with the Mets and Ernie Beam with the Lead City Grays. Those with 1 asterisk by their name played professional baseball either before or after the time in the hills. So I indicate this to show that most of the players participating in this series truly were professional ball players, and that they had come from all parts of the country. Game 1 played in Deadwood, Lead won 7-6. Now, Game 2 was played at a neutral site in Spearfish. Hundreds of fans who could not make the trip to Spearfish gathered around the Lead Times bulletin board and got an inning-by-inning progress report via telegraph. Deadwood won 11-6 to tie the series, and it was said that Deadwood backers, with their pockets full of cash from the bets they'd won, rode back to town with smiles on their face, like men returning from the funeral of their mother-in-law. Game 3 was back in Lead, and Lead won this game. He scored 6 runs in the 7th inning, aided by several costly Deadwood errors, and took a 7-5 win in a 2-1 series lead. Game 4 was in Deadwood, and they would alternate sites the rest of the series. Deadwood papers engaged in a little bit of trash talking before the game, saying that Ernie Beam, the starting pitcher for lead, quote, couldn't pitch rotten apples into a cider press. And the Met hitters proceeded to bat him out of the box in the third inning in a thoughtfully played game. Deadwood won 24-16 to tie the series at 2 games each. Game 5 in lead. Deadwood pitcher Frank Beamer was wild. He walked 7 in the first 3 innings, surrendered 21 hits, and lead cruised to an easy 15-3 win. When Beamer was finally replaced in the 7th inning, the poor boy was hit so hard that he wept like a child. He went to his place in the field with a heavy heart. Beamer was back on the mound in the box. Beamer was back in the box for Deadwood. The next day, and pitching much better, Deadwood won 16-8, tying the series at 3-3, setting up the decisive 7th game. The game was rather anticlimactic. Lead cruised to an easy 13-3 win to take the series 4-3. Now, the unexpected upset by lead over favorite Deadwood is written about in the form of classified ads in the local press. Lost, a purse of $500, somewhere between lead and Deadwood. And for sale or to rent, a baseball diamond, grandstand, all other auxiliaries, including 9 men, all in good condition. It was also written about in the form of an obituary. Died, the Deadwood Baseball Club, of heart failure, age 2 months and 15 days. Even a month later, Deadwood was still rubbing Deadwood's noses in it, bragging that the pennant still flouts the breeze with a $1,000 check pinned to it. By the mid-90s, the gold and silver mines had begun to play out, and less money was available to attract high salary players. Trafley and Moeller left town after the 1892 season, and most of the other professionals did not return. Teams continued to organize and play among themselves the rest of the decade, but the wholesale hiring of outside professionals had ended. The remote location of the region meant that the Hills never had a population large enough to support teams in organized baseball. However, based on the quality of the players attracted to the area, I would argue that outside the organized professional leagues, some of the most competitive baseball in the country was played in the Black Hills in the 1890s. So with that, I'll end and try to answer any question anyone might have.
Very good, Terry. There's a couple of comments and questions here. Ted Knorr writes that my question might seem whimsical, but it's a serious query on my behalf. My late friend Federico was a mad baseball researcher with a rather wide lens. He swore that Geronimo was a baseball player and a good one, especially from the perspective of the 5 tools, I guess, of a baseball player. My question, hopefully but not expected to be covered in the presentation, do you have any information on Geronimo playing baseball and anything you could pass along?
That I did not run across. That's not familiar to me. Sorry.
Okay. One of our attendees here, at least his iPad, Paul's iPad, send a link to an article where Geronimo is said to be playing against a cavalry team somewhere. Although I would expect, wasn't Geronimo mostly in the Southwest as opposed
Yeah,
to?
that would have been Arizona in that area as well.
But he was in Oklahoma, I think, when he was later, late in life. But nevertheless, that's about the only comment. It's interesting when you talk about leagues in South Dakota. When I was looking at that, there was one team, Philandro or something like that, was in a league in 1902, but most of them show up around 1920. There was apparently a South Dakota league that was in a number of small towns around there, although in the Midwest leagues and in the Western League, Sioux Falls and Sioux City show up a lot.
Yeah, I knew of that. I just hadn't researched it or looked very much detail at it. But you're right, that did occur. I also know that uh, Babe Ruth's on his tour, and I think 27, his postseason tour, stopped in Deadwood for a game. Yeah.
But he had a good time in the saloons there.
Yeah.
All right, well, Terry, thank you very much. It's a corner of the world that we don't know a lot about with regard to baseball, and as we learn more about the small town baseball, even in the 19th century, it's a fascinating thing. I'm going through some stuff now in the minor leagues, and you find towns you think you've never heard. I'm pretty good at geography, but there are towns you sit there and say, where the heck is that? And you get a lot of that in South Dakota, I imagine, and North Dakota. Peter, if you're ready, Terry, if you could take your slide down, and we'll get back to the. So there you go.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And if everybody wants to go back to gallery view, if you're on speaker view, we're back to normal. And Peter, if you unmute yourself, we can go to your comments.
Terry, that was great. I really, really appreciate you bringing this little corner of baseball, into the 21st century, and putting some life to it. It's really interesting. I went through the Black Hills once in my life with a Boy Scout group, making a bus trip on our way to Philmont, going back in the 1980s. And they were really Black Hills. When you saw them from the distance, you understood immediately how they got their name. But it was very, very interesting. I got one question I'd like to ask you. Bill Trapley, I know that his obituary, he died in, I think, Des Moines, Iowa, but I know his obituary says that he was born in Staten Island. And I am, I'm a Staten Island native. And of course, my interest was in all the 19th century players from Staten Island. But I was never able to find any documentation of Bill Trapley being from Staten Island, contemporary, census data, anything of that nature. Have you had any personal experience with that? I mean, I know his obituary and he's listed as being from Staten Island, but I was never able to document it.
It's interesting because I'm working on a bio for Traffley as we speak. Now, I've run across the same thing. The records say he was born on Staten Island, but no, I couldn't find any documentation of that. He had a brother who played one game in the major leagues a couple of years younger than him.
Yes, that's
born
right.
in Chicago. And
Right.
so I suspect that either they moved from Staten Island very shortly after Bill was born, or they were born in Chicago, because there's a family that matches with a slightly different spelling of the last name in Chicago.
Right.
But I can't verify any of that.
Yeah, I think Traffley himself, from what I recollect, kind of later in his life, personally said he was born in Staten Island, but, so it wasn't like a hearsay thing, it was something that he was actually articulating. But you're right, you ran against the same problem that I did, I guess, not being able to surface any kind of a census data or anything of that nature.
Couldn't find it.
Terry, one note, you were talking about the potential gunfire on the field during the series. I know of one incident where a player shot off a gun at a game. It was in the late 1880s. Louisville outfielder Charlie Hamburg brought a revolver in his pants to the outfield, and when somebody hit a fly ball to him, he started shooting at it. He dropped the gun and caught the ball before it hit the ground, but it was much more of an amusement than anybody objected to somebody carrying a gun. Maybe it was the part of town he was in. A lot of distilleries and beer houses there.
Different time.
Indeed.
Just a few more words. Thank you very much, Terry.
You're welcome. Thank you, everybody, for having me.
I just want to make mention that we are coming up on a deadline, actually. Monday, this coming Monday, the 18th of April, is our deadline for the collection of abstracts for next season's 19th Century Baseball Speaker Series. So if anybody here has any interest, if you have something in the frying pan, it's about a 200 or 400 word abstract, email to Bob and I, and we'll be able to get that out. Probably in about a month's time, we'll be able to solidify our season 3. So I want to make mention of that. Next, I also want to make mention that next month, I'm sorry, May the 10th, I think it is. Yes. Eric Frost will be doing a presentation on somebody who I always scratch my head about, Arthur Irwin, calling it something like the crazy life and crazier death of Arthur Irwin, who was somewhat of a real baseball fixture in the late 19th century. Having some contacts in Philadelphia and Boston and so forth and so on. So he's a tremendously interesting character, and I hope you guys will join us on May the 10th for that presentation. And then that'll be our final presentation for our season 2, and we'll be resuming again in September. So, but keep in mind that Monday is our deadline for research presentation abstracts to Bob or I for this series. A couple of other things are in the hopper. Of course, is the Fred coming up in a few weeks for the first time live in 2 years at Cooperstown at the Hall of Fame. We do have a announcement we made in our newsletter in the spring about our Southern New England chapter. It's the Southern New England Loire Start chapter, technically from Providence, headquartered in Providence. We're doing a symposium there, one of our 19th century baseball interdisciplinary symposiums. We have some very interesting speakers from everything from Brown University to RISD, Rhode Island School of Design, and a number of others, baseball historians too, and Ed Eckhorn, and a woman who's going to be our keynote is the president of the Rhode Island Historical Society. So that's in November. And in between, of course, is our national convention in August in Baltimore. I hope some of you will be able to come down there and join us for that. All right, I want to thank you all and Terry and Bob Bailey. And Bob, if there's nothing else, we'll say goodnight.
Thank everybody for joining us this evening, and look forward to learning more about Art Irwin. As you're right, he's a fascinating character. So much came out as a result of his death. Have a good night. Have a good month. Hope
Thank you.
spring comes to everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.